Hello class, welcome to this week's update video. Now that we are on lesson 7 on World War I, thought I'd do a quick update video, especially because I didn't do one last week for lesson 6, but I'm happy to see that the class still had some great discussion posts and great participation, so kudos to all of you on that and keeping up with the course. And now this week we're on to lesson 7, World War I. As usual, a quiz and discussion participation to do for this week. Now, next week will be spring break, so nothing will be due for that whole week or at the end of that week. Basically 2 weeks later, March 25th, we'll have lesson 8 due on the 1920s and also the Unit 2 exam. So you don't have to worry about that for quite a while. Enjoy your spring break next week. But as for this week, we have lesson 7, World War I, and I noticed that a couple of students have already participated in the forum with your initial posts, which is great. And by the way, I've responded to these and also caught up with all of the other responding to and grading all of the other posts up until this point. So you might go back and check my feedback on those, on my comments on those. But yeah, we're already off to a great start with the discussion, where you have kind of two clear contrasting arguments being made in this week's discussion. Woodrow Wilson in favor of U.S. participation in World War I, and the U.S. Socialist Party against participation in World War I. And this is coming shortly after the U.S. Socialist Party was kind of at its high watermark of influence and popularity. I mean, it was never super popular, but, it had maybe 5 or 6% of Americans voting for it in the 19-teens, in the 1912 election, roughly almost 1 million Americans voting for the party. So it wasn't, completely irrelevant, and it here provides what I think is the most direct contrasting point of view against Woodrow Wilson's points, which is why I feature it. In general, it's hard otherwise to find a primary source from the time period that really takes on and tries to point by point refute every one of Woodrow Wilson's points, because most Americans went along with and agreed with Woodrow Wilson's points here, even though just months previously Americans had re-elected Woodrow Wilson in the 1916 election on a platform of "he kept us out of the war," and wasn't that a good thing? He kept us out of the war being like his main campaign slogan in 1916. And then here, just a few months later, it's interesting to speculate as to what extent had he always wanted to get involved in the war, and now he kind of felt like he had the political capital to do so now that he had just been recently re-elected, or to what extent was it these recent turning points, like the German intensification or resumption of its submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, the Russian Revolution, things that are going on in 1917 that suddenly made it seem more imperative and plausible for America to get involved in the war. And was that sufficient justification to suddenly turn 180 degrees compared to the campaign platform he had just been running on to keep America out of the war? It's an interesting question that you can that we'll be looking at in this week's discussion post. And I thought I'd also take this opportunity to mention some ways in which, interestingly, this recent Russia-Ukraine war is turning out to be eerily similar to World War I, even to the extent that the war has been fairly static and attritional and kind of stuck in kind of almost World War I-like tactics, which nobody, I think, expected going to this Russia-Ukraine war. So it's interesting how relevant, not only in terms of diplomacy and this question of whether the U.S. should intervene, but the question of how the war itself is being fought on a tactical level is also still very similar now compared to 100 years ago. Here's a map of the front lines in Ukraine, just to give you a sense of where this is going on. Here's the US, here's Western Europe, here's Ukraine, here's Russia. So let's zoom in. Of course, here's Africa and so on. So let's zoom in on this battlefront. And each little mark shows kind of where some recent fighting has been. There's some parts of the front that are relatively quiet, especially where the Dnieper River separates the two. It's hard to really do much attacking across that river. In earlier parts of the war, Russia used to hold certain territory, like this area in blue, this area in blue, this area in blue around Kiev. They've since retreated from those areas, but Russia has still kept a foothold in parts of what used to be Ukraine, or still considered Ukraine, by a lot of people. This area of Kherson province, Zaporozhye province, Donetsk province, and Luhansk province. Those are kind of the four main areas. And where most of the fighting is going on right now is actually in the Donetsk and the Luhansk provinces, where leading up to this Russian invasion last year, there had already been fighting between so-called pro-Russian separatists and the Ukrainian government. Ukrainian government alleging that this was basically Russia starting an undeclared kind of war early on, and then Russia saying that they were not, the ones instigating, that instead there was this grassroots kind of revolution against the Ukrainian government that Russia was merely supporting and encouraging. So already before last year there was already disagreement over what exactly was going on, and then Russia upped the ante with lending more overt support to these separatist groups and annexing them formally to Russia, and also trying to invade other parts of Ukraine, which didn't go very well for Russia, and Russia felt like it had to retreat from those areas. But Russia has managed to maintain some of its gains so far, and the fighting has really settled down into very static warfare with a lot of block-to-block, house-to-house fighting. If I bring the map legend back up and I switch to the Google Earth view, the front lines have hardly advanced even in a matter of blocks in months. If you look at some of the footage, they're fighting in people's houses, basically people's apartment blocks. They're fighting against people like right across the street, and it's kind of bizarre to see. They're just fighting in people's homes. People's sofas and stuff. Getting just absolutely wrecked, and this is going on around the city of Ugledar, or in Ukrainian it's called Vuhledar. There's also one city that's really been fought over just incessantly over the last year, is the city of Marinka, where basically the lines haven't advanced more than a few city blocks either way in like the last year, and it's just been getting pounded with artillery on each side, where this looks like an atomic bomb went off, but it's not. This is just from conventional artillery rounds going over the same ground again and again and again, and really brutal destruction especially for these cities where the fighting has been bogged down in the same place for over and over again. This area, if you zoom into it on Google Maps, if you zoom into like this intersection right here, and you see what it looked like, well, here's back in, I guess, October 2011. So this is way before any of the fighting started. It's pretty nice. It's nothing fancy, but it's decent. It's a little town, probably about the size of Joplin, something like that, with a little main street, kind of like we would little Russian grandmas, Russian babushkas walking around, and fairly nice, decent place. And now it looks like this. So yeah, it just goes to show. I guess thankfully, in my opinion, this war, it's a good thing this hasn't this is still a local kind of regional war. Hasn't expanded into World War III, but you can imagine Americans looking at this, and similarly to how they looked at similar pictures coming out of World War I and wondering, wow, it's a good thing we're not involved in this with ground troops. Wouldn't it be just hellish to have our soldiers involved in this sort of attritional fighting, or maybe it wouldn't remain attritional fighting. Maybe one of the debates is how much American participation would it need to get past this attritional fighting and really settle this war quickly and decisively. Of course, nowadays we have the added complication of nuclear weapons, but so the context situation isn't exactly analogous. But I don't know. It's just interesting how eerily reminiscent a lot of the pictures are, that are coming out of this war, compared to pictures you see in World War I, where French villages that had just been fought over and torn up by artillery for years on end, where the front line hadn't moved more than a few city blocks, basically, how those looked equally devastated. And right now, the Russian side is making a little bit of a push recently around the city of Bakhmut. Maybe you've heard of that in the news, where over the past month or so, they've advanced basically where these darker red arrows are. So, but we're still only talking a matter of miles. We're in the big scheme of things, these are pretty small advances, where they've taken a few, villages and towns. Still pretty slow, but a quicker pace of advance than what we had been seeing, which is leading the pro-Ukrainian side to be somewhat nervous, and the pro-Russian side to feel like things are trending in their direction, even if, But then there's rumors of Ukraine, perhaps they're getting slowly beaten back here because they are marshaling their reserves for a more decisive counterattack elsewhere in the spring when the weather becomes better for it. Some people are anticipating that Ukraine will more than make up for those small losses with a much bigger counterattack, especially down here in this area, this part of the front, which has been relatively quiet. People are thinking here would be a logical place for a Ukrainian counterattack, especially when the ground dries up in the summer. It's relatively flat land and not as urbanized as this area around Bakhmut. So I don't know. It's just speculation at this point. We will see. But I just found some of these pictures eerily reminiscent of World War I. And the more things change, the more they stay the same, as they say. So, anyways, hope everyone enjoys this week's discussion, and then everyone has a great spring break. If I don't, make another one of these videos again, probably before that point. Have a great spring break, and have a great spring. See you all.